Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Welcome to today's reading from Brilliant as the Sun, a retelling of Srimad Bhagavatam, Canto 5, the Universal Order. We are reading from chapter 11, Bharata instructs Rahugana. Bharat looked at the pleading king. Did he have the humility for receiving transcendental knowledge? That should be easy to determine. Verse 1, Bharat said, "My dear king, although you have no realization of transcendence, you presume to speak as if you do. A wise man would never say such things." Rahugana said, "Can you disprove my points? Your examples apply only to a conditioned soul like you, not a liberated soul. They pertain to the material world by such external illustrations, such as your argument about cooking milk and rice on a fire. One cannot understand the absolute truth. I was trying to repeat the teachings of my court Brahmins." Verse 2, Bharat noted, "They must be followers of Jaimini Rishis, Karma Mimamsa philosophy, since they think attaining the heavenly planets is the highest goal of life. They understand nothing about the transcendence. It is a waste of time to speak to such people of the highest truth. They are only interested in those sections of the Vedas dealing with worldly happiness, not in the genuine spiritual advancement." Jadabharat turned his face away, indicating he would say no more and waiting to see how the king would react. Rahugana tried to suppress his rising frustration, but despite himself, he exclaimed, "Does it make sense to say you know the truth and others do not, and then refuse to teach them?" Rahugana briefly paced back and forth. Then, taking a deep breath, he stopped before Jadabharat. "Please excuse my outburst." Verse 3, Jadabharat looked into Rahugana's eyes. It was hard for the king to give up his pride, but he was doing his best. Bharat said, "Material happiness, which is ephemeral like a dream, is the primary concern of the Vedas. They teach how to increase worldly comfort and decrease distress. Before someone is eligible to understand higher knowledge, he must realize that the heavenly pleasures, liberation, and even mystic powers promised by the Vedas are insignificant." Rahugana sighed in relief. Despite his outburst, Jadabharat had not withdrawn into silence. He wrung his hands together. "Although I wish I could experience spiritual happiness, I cannot help being attracted to worldly enjoyment. Why is that?" Bharat smiled. It was an honest question. Verse 4, "As long as material nature influences the mind, it acts like a wild elephant, impelling the senses to engage in pious and impious acts, both of which simply keep one trapped in the cycle of repeated birth and death, enjoying and suffering." Verse 5, "When the mind is engrossed in material thoughts, we sometimes feel lusty and sometimes angry. My dear king, try to understand. Our material persona comprises 5 elements, 5 working senses, 5 knowledge acquiring senses, and the chief sense, the mind. The 3 modes of nature, goodness, passion, and ignorance, which vie for their prominence, all affect the mind. Because of this, we get our new body. If goodness influences the mind, we get a higher birth, and if passion influences it, we receive commensurately lower births. If passion or ignorance influences it, we receive lower births." Verse 6, "The material mind covers the soul and carries it to different species of life. The mind alone creates the conditioned living entities. Present happiness and distress or suffering, and it is the mind alone which keeps us bound in material existence. Rahugana's brow furrowed. Since the mind is material, how can it do this to the spirit soul? Bharat replied, the mind covers the soul and obscures his judgment. The soul, thus misguided, acts in ways which keep him in the cycle of repeated birth and death. The mind, verse 7, the mind causes the soul to wander through the different species of life, enjoying and suffering as a human, god, or as a thin or fat person, and so on. The learned say that the mind causes our bodily appearance. It also causes either our bondage or liberation. As they spoke, night fell. Rahugana ordered his guards to set up a camp and to bring lamps and rugs. Rahugana respectfully invited Bharat to take a seat and sat before him. The guards then dispersed the crowds. When they were both seated, Rahugana said, O Holy One, please explain how the mind can cause our bondage and liberation. Verse 8, Bharat said, when the mind is engrossed in material sense enjoyment, it causes continued birth and death in the material world. However, when the same mind becomes disinterested in worldly enjoyment, we attain liberation. Black smoke billowed out of some guttering lamps and wafted toward them. Rahugana turned irritably to his attendants. Those lamps need refilling. The guards hurriedly extinguished the offending lamps, leaving only those whose flames burned cleanly and brightly to illuminate the darkening night. Bharat said, the mind resembles these lamps, whose wicks burn improperly, creating black smoke. When detached from sense gratification, it illuminates our consciousness, enabling us to experience the sweetness of devotional service to Krishna. Can you explain in more detail how the mind works? Verse 9, it interacts with the 5 knowledge-acquiring senses and 5 working senses, whose fields of action are respectively the Tanmatras and the organic activities. O hero, the mind also interacts with the false ego, which determines what we identify with, such as the body and its extensions like family, society, and the country of birth. Rahugana raised his hands. Wait, I don't understand. Tanmatras, organic activities, false ego, what do you mean? Bharat smiled. Verse 10, be patient, king. I will explain. The Tanmatras are the subtle elements which our knowledge-acquiring senses contact, namely sound, touch, form, taste, and smell. By organic activities, I mean the natural functions of the working senses or organs. For example, the rectum's function is to evacuate, the mouth to speak, the hands to touch, the legs to walk, and the genitals to copulate. False ego is a subtle element which induces the soul to identify with the body and bodily possessions. Verse 11, the mind governs the senses and false ego and is influenced by them as they interact with the innumerable material objects. Rahugana said, how is that people react to the same sensory experience differently? For example, food, what one man likes, the other hates. Bharat said, this is because different combinations of nature's modes influence different people. Other things also affect how the mind interacts with the sense objects, such as one's age, inclinations arising from past lives, and current cultural differences. Also, Krishna directs the mind's interaction with the world in his form as the super soul. Rahugana said, what exactly is material conditioning? Verse 12, Bharat gave a small smile and nodded. Rahugana was asking thoughtful questions. He replied, a conditioned soul is one who has forgotten his eternal relationship with Krishna and seeks happiness independently of the Lord. The mind covers such souls and constantly presents endless suggestions for enjoying the external or material energy. Rahugana said, are all embodied souls conditioned? Not all. Conditioned souls do not realize how the mind works. They are in a dreamlike state, unaware of their real identity. Those who wake up from the mind's influence are liberated. They know that the mind can either keep one in material existence or elevate one to the spiritual atmosphere. They meditate as follows, verses 13 and 14. Krishna, who resides in the heart as a super soul, controls everyone. He pervades the entire creation. He is complete in himself and does not depend on anything. He knows everything. He is never subject to birth, death, old age, and or disease. He controls all the gods, including Brahma. All conditioned souls enter his Narayan form. At the time of annihilation, he has all excellences, wealth, strength, fame, beauty, knowledge, and renunciation unlimitedly. Everything and everyone in the material creation rests on him. He is Vasudev, the lord of the spiritual planets, and he is the master of Mathura and Dwarka. Do liberated souls see Krishna? Some see him in meditation, but others simply hear about him. What is the fate of conditioned souls? Verse 15, Bharat said, as long as you identify with the material body and seek sensual enjoyment, the six enemies will victimize you and you will remain asleep to spiritual realization. They will force you to travel in the material world, birth after birth, from one species to another. Rahugana swallowed. What are these six enemies? Lust, anger, greed, illusion, madness, and envy. Rahugana thought of his court Brahmins. They claimed to be liberated but differed greatly from this person. He was certainly more detached than them. The king asked, how can I tell if someone is liberated? Verse 16, Bharat replied, unlike liberated souls, conditioned souls identify with the body attached to the sense objects. They are disturbed by bodily discomfort and lament, fail to see Krishna's hand in all situations, become obsessed with material possessions, experience dissatisfaction and feel enmity toward others. All of this binds the conditioned soul to worldly existence where he suffers so many miseries. Rahugana said, you are saying the key difference between the conditioned and liberated soul is the mind's contemplation. The conditioned soul's mind is immersed in bodily pleasures and pains, and liberated souls in thoughts of Krishna. That's correct. How can I change my mind's fascination from matter to Krishna? An excellent question, verse 17. Dear King, you must first realize the urgency of controlling your mind. If you do not, you are living with your worst enemy, which will only get stronger and will ultimately ruin you. You must defeat the mind by neglecting its demands. The mind is dictating to us, but we must refuse to listen. Rahugana pressed his hands together. How was it possible to ignore the mind? He looked earnestly at Bharat. What if I am not strong enough? Is there anything else I can do? Yes, you must engage in Bhakti Yoga with great care, daily hear about and glorify Krishna, chant his holy names and worship him as instructed by the spiritual master. If you do this, then one day by Krishna's grace, you will conquer your mind. And this brings to the end of chapter 11. And next we will commence from chapter 12, Rahugana's doubts. So thank you for watching. Hare Tatsat. Hare Krishna.